Hello, and welcome to our training webinar on discrimination and harassment prevention. Now, I know this is not typically everybody's favorite topic, and I'm not with you there in person to read everybody's faces, but that's usually the way that this goes. More than any other class that we do, I see this one typically fill up from the back of the room. And I get it. I've got to do this mandatory training as an employee of Baycorp as well. And most of the time, we're not excited to have to sit through, a mandatory meeting of any kind like that. Um, but what I can tell you from my experience of doing quite a few of these and coming from Baycorp, just to give you a little background on that, is unfortunately we do see a lot of issues coming out of this area. So this isn't an exercise in me trying to waste my time or waste your time. But what I can tell you, again, from Baycorp's perspective, and just to step back and explain that a little bit, Baycorp, we're a self-insurance risk pool in the state of Virginia here that you all participate in, along with hundreds of other members throughout the state. And so it sets us up in this nice kind of 10,000 foot view where we're really seeing what's happening the whole state over. And as I said before, unfortunately, nobody's immune to these types of problems. So sometimes we want to kind of roll our eyes and think, man, this is a waste of time. But unfortunately, this is relevant information and probably is relevant information for some of your coworkers there, and really is relevant to all of us because no one's immune to the issues of discrimination and harassment. I've seen issues in some of our largest counties to some of our smallest little authorities that operate throughout the state. So it can and does strike really anywhere. And so that's the whole purpose of our training that we're doing here today, is we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we understand essentially the policy that's in place and how to use it. Because you all at Frederick County actually do have a pretty robust discrimination and harassment policy that's in place. It was actually just updated this year following the Virginia General Assembly 2020 updates. So, it's new. They've been taking a look at it, but it's not really going to do you any good if you don't know that it's there and you don't know how to use it. So a big part of what we're going to be doing throughout this hour is taking a look at your actual policy as we go through this training. So before we get started, I just wanted to point out your human resources department did a good job of putting these slides together to show you exactly where you can go to find your policy. So as you can see here from your webpage, you want to go down to the intranet section there. Then you want to select human resources. And you can see from the second picture on the slide, then you also want to select HR policy, which will bring up this screen. And then down there towards the bottom, you can see the non-discrimination, non-harassment policy. And if you click on that, you'll really get to see what your actual policy says on the topics that we're discussing here. And I've actually copied it throughout my slides here throughout this presentation. So you'll be able to see it. It follows this pattern. We're going to actually hit on every one of these bullet points throughout the slides, starting in a little bit here. But before we get into that, I just want to give you a little bit of background of what we're talking about when we say discrimination. So discrimination is defined as the treatment or consideration of or making a distinction in favor of or against a person or thing based on the group, class, or category to which that person or thing belongs, rather than on individual merit. So essentially, I think some of these definitions can be a bit of a mouthful, but what it's saying there is anytime we're making a distinction about a person based on one of these characteristics, their group or class or category to which they belong, rather than on their individual merit, that's when we're looking at discrimination. That's what we want to avoid doing. Instead, we want to be making these decisions and distinctions based on someone's individual merit alone and not taking into account any of these extraneous categories or classes that they might be belonging to. And the whole purpose behind anti-discrimination laws is essentially just to eliminate bias and make opportunities more fair across the board throughout the workplace. So you sometimes hear it said that these are laws of comparison. They're not laws of quotas. And really what that means is there's not a requirement for you to go out and find X number of people with this particular religious background or X number of people with this national origin. What instead it's saying is we just don't really want to take that into consideration when we're choosing which employees to employ and how to promote. We want to be doing that based on ability alone and kind of ignoring some of those protected class characteristics instead. So I wanted to show you where the protected classes land today, and that's what we have here on this slide. So under federal law, there are certain groups that are protected from discrimination in the workplace, and they're known as protected classes. And every state actually, of course, has to adhere to those federal protected classes, but most states will actually add a couple in of their own. So we're just looking at what we have here in the state of Virginia, because this will encapsulate everything on the federal level, as well as some of the new updates that have come out of that, again, that 2020 Virginia General Assembly as well. And your policy, this is actually taken verbatim from your policy, has already been updated to encapsulate all of those additions as well. So of course, race, color, religion, sex, national origin, all things that are showing up on the federal protected classes as well, age, marital status, disability, military status, veteran status, gender identity, sexual orientation, which is a newer addition. It's been kind of acknowledged under the category of sex for a while, but it has under, one of the updates with the General Assembly recently was kind of breaking that out and not just making it an assumption thing, but kind of explicitly naming that, genetic information as well. So all of these are protected classes, and under federal and state law, we are prohibited from making any type of employment decisions based on these characteristics. And that typically inevitably leads to a question of like, well, what about harassing or discriminating not based on one of these characteristics, right? What if I'm picking on you, but it's not because of any of these groups that you belong to or characteristics you have, it's just because I don't like you for some other reason, right? And that's where we get into the workplace bullying. So it's important to realize these EEO or equal employment opportunity laws are not intended to be a workplace civility code. So not all harassment is technically illegal. It's actually got to be premised upon one of those particular categories, one of those protected classes that we looked at for it to be legally actionable. And that's a problem because general workplace bullying is actually estimated to be about 4 times more prevalent than some of the illegal forms of harassment. So for example, if you're saying, you're picking on me and saying, hey, I don't like you because I think you're dumb and I think you're ugly. Well, those actually aren't protected classes, right? So you're free when you're looking at the federal and state protections from that standpoint, but we could be still getting into the workplace bullying side of things. And actually, Virginia was the 28th of 29 states to introduce the Healthy Workplace Bill, which would be prohibiting workplace bullying on a state level, but that died in the House. And currently, no states have actually been able to enact any anti-bullying legislation on a statewide basis. That doesn't necessarily mean that nothing can be done from it. Workplace bullying can actually still be addressed in your employer's workplace civility policy. It's just not being addressed kind of the way that we're seeing some of those protected classes at the federal and state level. So it's important to realize this or point this out because you guys actually do have a workplace bullying policy. You've got that civility code that we talked about. It says right in your handbook that all individuals are to be treated with respect and dignity, and basically fostering a professional atmosphere in the workplace. Offensive conduct that's contrary to your professional expectations is going to be subject to disciplinary action. So it's important to point this out so you can't say, hey, well, how can you discipline me for this? I wasn't making fun of them because of any of these protected classes. I just don't like them because of X, Y, and Z. Well, the answer is, Frederick County has covered that as well. So I wanted to get that out of the way and make sure you understand that, because we're going to be talking about discrimination. We're going to be talking about harassment. And a lot of that's going to be through the lens of some of these protected classes that we saw on that previous screen. But I want you to realize this applies across the board. There's really no reason that we're able or allowed to pick on our coworkers and expect to get away with it and expect to not see some sort of disciplinary action come out of it. So just wanted you to be aware of that. So now that we've kind of broken into the policy, so to speak, I also wanted to point out a couple other areas that are written, those first couple bullet points in your policy. And the first has to do with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And essentially, of course, just like all the other protected classes, you're prohibited from discriminating against somebody based on their disability. But beyond that, it's important to point out that anybody that this would apply to, the ADA applies to, you can expect some reasonable accommodations to be made. And if you're wondering how to do that, those requests should be made to the Director of Human Resources. They'll They'll take it under advisement. They'll try to determine if it's a feasible request that you're making, and let you know essentially the outcome, because that is something that is provided to you under the law. If it's a reasonable accommodation, your employer is on the hook to make that for you. And that actually applies in a similar vein when we're talking about pregnancy and childbirth as well, and related medical conditions to that. So again, can't discriminate against somebody with pregnancy or pregnancy-related medical conditions, and this applies to all areas of employment, not just hiring and firing decisions, but promotions, demotions, things of that nature as well. And again, if you fall into this category, you can also expect reasonable accommodations to be made if you are letting the director of HR know about that. And those could include things that are like the following that are listed below in your policy: longer bathroom breaks, maybe even a modified light duty temporary assignment until you've recovered, things of that nature. So because we're tackling these policies today, this is a little bit outside of the vein of what we're going to be talking about the rest of the class here. But I wanted to make sure that we touched on those areas because that's right there written in your policy. Now, the next section from there is where it actually gets into the harassment piece. And harassment defined for us here includes verbal and physical conduct, anything that's going to be creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. And then after addressing harassment in a general sense here, your policy goes on to specifically single out sexual harassment as well, and provide a definition for this: any type of unwelcome sexual conduct. That also includes verbal and physical conduct. And it lays out for us a couple basically different ways we can categorize this. Anything that's made a condition of employment, as well as anything that's creating, again, that intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. So really what it's telling us, it's essentially breaking sexual harassment down into the two broad categories that it's commonly referred to. And those would be quid pro quo sexual harassment, as well as hostile work environment sexual harassment. So those are the two categories. Quid pro quo, just essentially, it's a Latin phrase that means this for that, or one thing in exchange for another. And of course, in the context that we're talking about it here today, we're talking about some sort of sexual favor being demanded in return for a job benefit, where the acceptance or rejection of the sexual advances is used as a basis for employment decisions. Now, this can be something that's explicitly stated, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. This could be also something that's just strongly implied as well. And we'll sometimes kind of hear complaints come from it on that end, saying, hey, well, how can they say that I was harassing them, right? Like, I never made them sign anything. I never put it in writing, so I'm good to go, right? And the answer is no, not necessarily. This could be something that's just strongly implied as well. And an example of what we're talking about on the quid pro quo side would be something like a manager telling his employee, hey, I'll give you a raise if you go out on a date with me, right? There's some sort of employment perk or benefit being exchanged for some sort of sexual or romantic favor here. One thing in exchange for another, this for that, that's quid pro quo. Now, the other side of it that we mentioned is the hostile work environment sexual harassment. And this is just an environment where the unwelcome sexual conduct is so severe or pervasive that it unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance. So essentially, whatever's going on within the confines of the office is just creating an intimidating, offensive working environment, right? It's just not a pleasant place to work. Nothing's being traded back and forth in this case. It's just, again, just that offensive working environment. So an example of this would be something like consistently touching a coworker who's asked you to stop doing it. Nothing's being traded. Nothing's saying, hey, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. It's just whatever's happening within the confines of this office is just making it an uncomfortable, unpleasant place for this person to be. That's what we're talking about with a hostile work environment, sexual harassment. And the reason that your policy specifically kind of singles out sexual harassment after we've got the general policy for harassment, and the reason that you're not going to see, an individual policy statement for every one of those protected classes, right? We talked about age and religion, national origin, and things of that nature. It's just because sexual harassment tends to be a pretty prevalent pitfall in the workplace, if you will. So to put this in terms of some numbers, the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, dealt with over 23,000 sexual harassment charges last year. And that was about a third of the total charges that they were dealing with. So that's just a disproportionately high number, right? When you think of all the other protected classes that they have, they're dealing with, 10 or 12 of them. To have a third coming out of one category just shows us, well, this is just a bigger issue than some of the others, and deserves a little bit more of that specific attention. We're pretty much right on par with what we're seeing at the federal level. If you look at just isolating Virginia's EEOC claims, about a third of those are sex-based claims. I like to keep in this quote, it says 7 out of 10 HR managers dealt with a sexual harassment complaint in the past year, because it really reiterates that point that I started our talk with, which is that, hey, hopefully you're not having an issue here. Hopefully you never have an issue here. But unfortunately, it's not outside the realm of possibility. It's something that, if you haven't had to deal with it in the past, chances are at some point, it's going to be something that comes across your radar. This is a big issue that does manifest itself throughout the workplace. I like using this study that was done back in 2008 by a group called Aware, simply because it's old at this point. A lot of the things that I hear as far as pushback goes doing a topic like this is, is this blown out of proportion? Is this just because, and obviously the coronavirus has kind of derailed us a bit, but this has really captivated the center of the country's attention. The last couple of years, you've had the Me Too movement and Time's Up and all that kind of stuff. And so some people are saying, well, is this really a big issue, or do we just think it's a bigger deal than it is because of, it's really carried all over the media and has been for so long? And the answer here is, going back to 2008, talking to 500 people from 92 companies, actually over half of the people they talked to claimed that they had experienced some sort of sexual harassment on the job. That doesn't necessarily mean it ever escalated to the point where they were filing a formal complaint or it resulted in a claim or a lawsuit. But just thinking back on their own careers, said, yeah, this is something that I've had to deal with at some point. A couple other key findings that came out of this study: 57% of the time that was coming from the supervisor. So basically that example we saw on the quid pro quo side of kind of exploiting that power imbalance. And that's an area that I think we tend to think of it when we picture sexual harassment in our minds. Oh, that's, someone with power preying on somebody who's a subordinate. And we think about that for good reason. Obviously, that's a high percentage of these reported instances. But I leave that in there to point out we're not at 100%. So I don't want us to be stuck in the rut of thinking that's what sexual harassment always looks like. This can actually come from your coworkers. It can come from subordinates. It can actually come from outside third-party vendors who aren't even employees of the county as well. So it really can come from any angle you can think of. On that same token, looking at the victims, 79% were women. I think, again, that's not a surprise. Typically, the way most of us picture sexual harassment in our minds, we're thinking, oh, yeah, that's a man harassing a woman. And certainly that happens quite a bit. But again, I do want to point out we're not at 100% here. So again, we just don't want to be stuck in the rut thinking, well, hey, you're coming and complaining to me about harassment, but you're a dude, so that can't be. It must be something else. No, this can also come in any different combination you can think of. This can be women harassing other women, men harassing other men, things of that nature as well. So the point here being is, yeah, there's some certain patterns that emerge, some trends that I think that most of us are aware of. But again, this can happen in any different variety of ways here. And then a couple other big takeaways that really illustrate what we're doing today with this training. 2/3 of the people didn't even know they had a policy in place. And this was done exclusively at companies that had a policy. And even the people that knew, like, yeah, I know we have something, I'm sure, in this case, I'm sure that the county's got a policy. I've just never really looked at it. That happened here as well. Half the people, even knowing that they were aware there was a policy, they didn't really know how to use it. They didn't know what to do with it, hadn't really read it. And I think, most of us are typically guilty of that. We're not taking the handbook home, typically for some afternoon reading or anything like that. But that's another key takeaway here, and a reason that we're going to be looking at your policy. With that in mind, this is taken right from your policy as well. Individuals and conduct covered. Again, as we said before, it's not just that manager to subordinate relationship we're looking at. This can come from, as I said, even outside vendors. Well, that's listed right in your policy, right? Contractors, clients, vendors, or others. And this is any work-related setting, even if it's outside the workplace as well. So that this policy kind of applies across the board when you're doing anything that's work-related. So yes, it's possible if you're working from home right now to be harassing your coworkers over Zoom or over a chat or something of that nature. And of course, business trips, business meetings, things like that as well. So we've looked at the two broad categories, the quid pro quo and the hostile work environment. Now let's take a look at a couple different forms that harassment can take, like on the practical level here. Well, there's verbal, there's nonverbal, and there's physical conduct. And if you remember from your policy specifically mentioned that this could be something that's verbal or it could be something that's physical. And that's a really important distinction to make. And the reason being, prior to a 1980 Supreme Court ruling, in order to sexually harass somebody, you had to be physically touching them. And now, it's been 40 years since that ruling. You'd be surprised this still trips people up today. And we'll hear things like, well, how can they say I was harassing them? I never even touched them. And the answer is, well, you don't have to anymore. This could be just something that you're saying or something that you're displaying or gestures or mannerisms. And of course, as well as physical conduct as well. So I wanted to give you a couple examples of what we're talking about here. These won't be exhaustive lists, but on the verbal side of things, calling somebody by a nickname or a pet name, whistling cat calls, sexual innuendos, dirty jokes, really what it's showing us here is that anything you can possibly verbalize with a sexual connotation to it could potentially be perceived as sexual harassment. And the way that I worded that was actually pretty important. Right now, typically, I'm not with you. I can't see the reactions on faces, but this is usually where you see some smirks and people looking around and elbowing each other because they're thinking, man, dirty jokes and stories, personal comments about someone's clothing or love life or anything. And no, I've seen half this stuff already happen today. And the answer is, just because it's on this list, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sexual harassment. That's why that wording was so important. What I said was all of these things could potentially be perceived as sexual harassment. And that's a key takeaway and something I want you guys to all kind of cue in on here. One of the difficulties with tackling this subject is it's pretty nuanced. There's a lot of gray area to it because intention is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you had the best of intentions and you weren't trying to offend somebody or hurt their feelings. It's really all in the eye of the beholder. So depending on context, anything on this could potentially be perceived as harassment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be, right? We spend a lot of our time at work. You're going to have close relationships with some of your coworkers. You're going to be talking about sometimes personal details of your life and sharing stories or jokes or whatever. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're harassing them. But what it does mean is you want to have kind of that red flag go up in the back of your mind. Proceed with caution anytime you're getting into any of these types of topics. You never know, even if somebody were to overhear it, even if you're just sharing a joke in the lunchroom and someone standing nearby overhears it, and you obviously didn't intend to offend that person, but again, intentions are relevant. It's all the way that it's perceived, all in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. So I can't give you a black and white list of do this and you always be fine, do this and you're always going to get in trouble. There's going to be some certain things we can agree on, of course, and some general trends that we can talk about. But a lot of it's going to exist in this kind of gray area. So what are we talking about on the nonverbal side? Well, we're not saying anything anymore at this point. We haven't yet gotten to the point where you're touching somebody. So what we're talking about with nonverbal harassment are the gestures, the mannerisms, and the biggest thing here are things that you're displaying, right? It might be a coffee cup or a poster someone has up in their office or a t-shirt that they wear. All of these things, again, could potentially be perceived as harassment if somebody finds it offensive. And you can see here on the list other things as well, looking someone up and down, blocking their path, restricting their movements, following them around, all that fun stuff as well. So again, don't have to be touching somebody, don't even have to be saying anything to them, and you could still potentially land yourself into some hot water for harassment on the nonverbal side. And then finally, physical conduct tends to be the most obvious. Like I said before, prior to 1980, this was already recognized as potential for sexual harassment. It was the only thing that was. So anytime that you're touching another human being, there's a potential they don't want you to be touching them. In that case, they can perceive that as sexual harassment. And this goes the whole way up to, the most egregious there being assault, something that we can draw a black and white line on and can all agree on here. But again, just want to illustrate the point that there is quite a range, and even this isn't an exhaustive list, as I said before, of what could potentially be sexual harassment. And really just to hammer home that gray area, you see a lot of different skits and comics and things of that nature on this topic. Something like this, right? You've got two different guys saying the exact same thing to the exact same woman and getting two different reactions, right? And this is a comic. It's just supposed to be funny. There's actually a pretty good sketch that Saturday Night Live did years back, basically illustrating this in a sketch form with Tom Brady kind of being the good-looking guy or whatever. But the takeaway here is that this is a little bit of the reality of what we're up against in the workplace. There's not a hard and fast rule necessarily of what's going to always be over the line, what's not. You're going to see a little bit of a double standard to some of these things. And I typically like to hammer that home by doing this exercise here. Obviously, we can't do that today, but I just want to get you kind of thinking on these lines here. Typically, we would try to rate these things from least offensive to most offensive on a scale of 1 to 10. And you probably can already understand what the point of this exercise would be. And the point is there's no right or wrong answer to this. And especially, in a group the size that we would be doing in Frederick County, we are not going to go 10 for 10, right? We might see a couple patterns emerge or some trends or some things, might be a couple things we agree on, but we're not going to go 10 for 10. There's not a correct order to this. And it really highlights the fact that we all have different thresholds for what we think is appropriate. And that's where this gets really dangerous, because we tend to like to project what we think and assume that everybody has to feel the same way. Oh, I think this would be really funny, or this wouldn't bother me, so therefore it should be fine to do. Nobody's going to have a problem with it. Be careful with that. Not everybody feels the same way you do. So let's just look at a couple of these here. Another employee calls you honey. Anytime you go out to eat, typically your server is going to be using some sort of pet name with you, or at least that happens quite a bit. And most of the time that doesn't bother us, right? Because we know that they're treating everybody the same way. We don't necessarily feel singled out. And that happens in our offices as well. I can tell you, even in my office, I've got coworkers who talk this way. They call everybody honey or some variation of that, or a pet name. And typically it doesn't bother anybody, right? We all kind of feel like that's just the way they talk. We let them get away with it because we know that they don't really mean anything by it. That's just the word that they use. But on the flip side, you can probably also think of a couple coworkers that if they used that same word and started calling you honey, that really creep you out a little bit. And therein lies the nature of the subjectivity of it, right? There's nothing really intrinsic in the word itself. It's all the context. It's all the way it's used. If it's coming from this person, might feel fine. If it's coming from this person, might be really a problem for us. So there's that double standard element to it. Coworkers continuously using obscene language in the lunchroom. Some of our coworkers couldn't bother them in the least. That's how they grew up talking. They're not even going to notice it. And we probably also know some coworkers or friends that it's just really grating on them, right? It just doesn't hit their ears right. They really just do not appreciate obscene language. It really bothers them. So there's not a right or wrong answer here. It's just to illustrate the point that we have different thresholds for what we think is appropriate. Dirty jokes and cards getting passed around the office. Man, you've got some coworkers who are thinking, man, that's my favorite part of the day, right? Like I can't wait to get to lunch. Jim always has a hilarious story to share. I can't wait to hear it. Just because you feel that way doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else does. You got to be really careful with those types of things. Again, when in doubt, take the high road. It's not worth going down this path if you're not sure. Even if you're thinking, hey, I think this is fine, this wouldn't bother me. Be careful with that stuff. Another good one here, supervisor massages your shoulders. Physical touch is just an important distinction to hit on, because there's just such a range of comfort with it, right? There's some people that are thinking, man, if there was a stranger on the street that was passing out free back rubs, I'd be the first one out there to get one, because that just sounds nice, right? Like a back rub, I could use one. My shoulders are a little tense, whatever. You probably also know people in your life that they do not like to be touched in any context, that they're just a little bit more skittish with it, makes them jumpy. Even with somebody who's a close friend or family member, they don't like it, right? So again, not a right or wrong answer, just different thresholds that we're looking at. So I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but I think it's a really important point to make, that your intention doesn't really matter. It's the way that somebody else is receiving this, and you've got no control over that. So when in doubt, you got to be careful. be professional, take that high road. So we've kind of talked at length now at the subjective nature of this, how kind of gray and nuanced this area can be. So what are some of those concrete things we can actually hold on to navigate something that's so nebulous like this? And for that, we got to go back to the definition. And if you remember, it said it's got to be unwelcome and either severe or pervasive. So those are going to be the tests that we're looking at to determine whether or not it's harassment. So it's got to be unwelcome in the sense the employee did not solicit or incite it, and in the sense the employee regarded the conduct as undesirable or offensive. So that's always going to be our starting point, right? If it's not unwelcome, we're not talking about harassment. A great example of this would be something like if you've got a married couple that works there at the county and you see them walking to lunch holding hands one day. You might be tempted to think after doing a class like this, oh man, they're physically touching each other. Is this going to be a big deal? Are they going to get in trouble? Are we going to heaven forbid, have to do a whole nother hour on training like this? And the answer is no, right? They're allowed to walk to lunch holding hands because they're on the same page. It's a married couple. There's not an unwelcome component to it. So as long as the conduct's welcome and we can throw it out, we can ignore it there. So our starting point is always going to be, is this something that's unwelcome? And if it is, then we move on to our next criteria to see if it's either severe or pervasive. So it's got to be severe enough to alter an employee's workplace experience, even though the conduct occurred just once or rarely, or it's got to be pervasive enough to be more than merely an accidental or isolated event, and thus becoming a defining condition of the workplace, even if no single act viewed by itself would be considered harassment. So what these mean here is there are certain things that in and of themselves, maybe not a huge deal. I'll use the example of asking a coworker out on a date. Nothing wrong with asking your coworker out. You're saying, hey, we're getting out early today. You want to go grab coffee after work? And they can accept or they can politely decline, and no big deal. We go on our merry way. But this can be an issue if it gets pervasive, right? What if you're asking that same person out for coffee 12 times a day for the last 3 weeks? That's an issue, right? Even though in and of itself, nothing wrong with asking them out to coffee, it's becoming so pervasive, it's becoming a defining condition of the workplace. You're harassing them at this point. So that's how it works on the pervasive side. On the flip side, there are certain things that are so severe that we don't have to wait until they become pervasive for them to be a problem. The most obvious example, of course, would be any type of assault, right? You don't have to sit back in your office and say, well, Bob's only assaulted 3 people so far this week. If he gets to 5 by Friday, we're going to have to call him in. Right now, that's ridiculous, right? It's so severe that once is already more than enough. That already constitutes harassment. So there's this kind of twofold test, if you will, because again, there's such a wide range of potential offense when you're talking about harassment. And that's why if you look at your disciplinary policy, it says this somewhat vague phrase of discipline is going to be up to and including termination. And sometimes people don't like seeing that terminology in a policy. They say, man, that's really vague, right? Why can't you just tell me what it's going to be? Is it a slap on the wrist? Is it immediate termination? And the answer is this is exactly what you want to see in a disciplinary policy for this particular topic. And the reason being, there's that wide breadth of offenses, as we said before. You don't want to be hemmed in on either side. You don't want a zero tolerance policy that says, hey, if you violate our harassment policy, you're fired on the spot, right? Because certain things are pretty minor. You don't want to have to be called into your supervisor's office and them say, hey, we heard you said a joke at lunch today. Personally, I thought it was really funny, but so-and-so really didn't like it. So go clean out your desk, right? That's a little bit too extreme. The punishment doesn't really quite fit the crime. But on the flip side, as we said before, you don't want to be hemmed in with an escalating policy where it says the first offense is just going to be a verbal warning, then we're going written warning, and it's going in your file, and then suspension and all this kind of stuff. Because again, what if this is a more serious offense like assault? You don't want to be, again, have your hands tied to saying, well, it's the first one. All we can really do is a little slap on the wrist. So it's important for you guys to know how your disciplinary policy works here. And this is a discretionary policy up to and including termination. So it is possible, depending on the nature of the offense, that you could be let go right away. It's also possible that you wouldn't necessarily be, depending on how that goes and how the investigation all plays out. So who's really responsible for preventing any type of harassment or disrespectful behavior from happening in the office. And what we have here is just like a little smiley face picture of how this usually works. We've got our source, the source of the harassment that's picking on the target. Typically, this isn't happening in a vacuum. So you'll have people like the observer who are just aware of what's happening. And of course, all of this is happening under the formal hierarchical structure of the manager or supervisor. So who's responsible for stopping this? And the short answer, of course, is the source, right? The source obviously has the ability to stop this. So the takeaway here is if you think your behavior is offending somebody else, again, even if you're thinking, well, yeah, maybe I'm pushing the line a little bit, but I think this is just kind of funny, so I'm going to go with it. If there's any question in your mind, stop doing it. If you're not sure, ask somebody. And the reality is, in some cases, people do know, they just don't care. And if you're in that camp, be aware that there are consequences, right? That's why we just looked at your disciplinary policy. You know, if you're going to be picking on someone and harassing someone, there are going to be real consequences for that. So, of course, the source has the most power to stop this situation from occurring, but it doesn't stop there. Believe it or not, the target actually has some power in this case as well. And so this is meant to just be kind of emboldening you or empowering you to be able to take control of your own destiny, so to speak. But believe it or not, the target actually does have some power in this case to tell somebody if that behavior offends you. I've seen counties where it's written into their policy, even before talking to their supervisor, the first step is, hey, go to that person, see if you can work it out, because sometimes these things are just misunderstandings, or it's, you know, an inside joke that gets taken too far, and maybe at first they were fine with it, but now it's crossing the line. So sometimes these are just misunderstandings. It's not because someone's just maliciously trying to destroy you. So use your judgment, right? In some cases, that's not going to be an option, but in some cases it will be. So you do have that ability to talk to the source as well. So of course, if the target can do this, well, the observer has that ability as well. They can be more than just a bystander. You've got the power to advocate for the target as well. And a lot of times this goes over better than the target even saying something themselves. You know, pulling your coworker aside and saying, hey, you know, I know that you've been picking on so-and-so or doing this or that, and I know you think it's like funny and everything, but you know, you might want to cool it with this. I don't think that they think it's as funny as you think they do. And that can mean a lot coming from an outside third party. So the observer has that ability as well. And finally, you know, the most formal power and responsibility, of course, is going to reside with the manager or supervisor. So big part of that is being aware of what's going on and being proactive. These tend to be the types of situations where people don't like to come forward. They don't really like to rock the boat. They're uncomfortable, kind of unpleasant things. But we can't just turn a blind eye to that and just assume, hey, nobody said anything, so it's probably fine. We want to be as proactive as possible in this area. So speaking of the manager or supervisory role in all of this, you know, what if you report harassment to your supervisor and say, hey, I don't want you to do anything about this. I just want you to listen to me and be aware of what's going on. How should your supervisor respond in that case? And I bring this up because this is a pretty common theme that we see in this area. Again, because it doesn't always follow that black and white textbook harassment type thing where there's some sort of, you know, predator waiting in a back alley or waiting to pounce on somebody. Sometimes these things are just kind of uncomfortable, and we hear these things a lot where employees will come and say, hey, please don't do anything about this. It's really not a huge deal, just more uncomfortable than anything. You're probably just going to make it worse if you say something, so please don't say anything, but I just want you to be aware of what's going on. And they might say that for a couple of reasons. They might be saying, I just want you to be aware of what's going on because, you know, I come to work at the same time every day with so-and-so, and we just don't get along, right? They're kind of harassing me a little bit. Again, it's not a big deal, but I want you to be aware so that maybe I can come in 10 minutes late to avoid this person. And I'll stay 10 minutes late, you know, I'll still put in the time or whatever, but that would just really help me to avoid this person. And that might feel like a good solution. You're thinking, oh, great, I didn't even know this was a problem. You've already come to me with a solution. But the reality is that's not a great response from your supervisor. They actually have the responsibility to ensure the integrity of the workplace. And a big part of that is exercising what's known as reasonable care. There's a reasonable care standard, which says that we've got to first prevent any harassment from happening in the first place, but secondly, promptly correct it once we know about it. So you may very well be telling your supervisor and really want them to keep it quiet and really not want them to do anything. But I want you to be aware, once you let them know, at that point, your employer knows about it, and they do actually have a responsibility to take some sort of action. So just be aware, you have set some things in motion, and that's the way that it should be. It's really not, it can kind of feel nice to avoid conflict and confrontation and just sweep it under the rug or sidestep an issue. But we really do want to be handling these things directly. You know, in the example that I gave of coming in 10 minutes late and staying 10 minutes late, it's not really a solution, right? Other people are going to notice that. Maybe they're going to want to do the same thing. Is it possible that the source could come in 10 minutes late also? Is it possible they're also picking on somebody else? All of these things could be happening. So again, you want to address these as directly as possible. And I want you all to be aware that your supervisors do have that responsibility. So once you tell them about something, you are going to be kicking that off. So right in your policy, you have reporting obligations listed out there. So anybody who's been subject to some sort of harassment or even who has witnessed it, like the observer, they've got that responsibility to notify their supervisor or their department head, or actually going to HR. And I want to point that out because it's really important that we know how we can report these issues. And it's really crucial that we have multiple avenues of reporting. You don't want to have a policy that says, hey, if you're having an issue, go tell your supervisor. Because what happens if you're having an issue with your supervisor? You always need to have multiple avenues of reporting. And I wanted to point out, you do have that. You can talk to your supervisor. You can talk to your department head. You can talk to the director of HR. And at that point, they're going to have to investigate. They're going to try to keep it as confidential as possible, but of course can't guarantee that confidentiality, right? They're going to keep it quiet, but they do have that responsibility, as we talked about before. So even if that's what you truly want, for them to not do anything, they've got to look into it, right? And then of course, all of our role in this is we have to cooperate with that as well. I'm not going to spend much time here. It's really no surprise that this, being discrimination or harassment, really impacts the victim in a negative way. It can manifest itself in some physical related problems, anxiety or depression, maybe the whole way up to needing to resign just to avoid the harassment altogether. So no surprise here, really not a good situation for the victim. Nobody wants to be the victim in one of these situations, but it goes beyond this. It doesn't just impact the victim alone. It really has a full organizational impact. Studies show that it can lead to increased turnover, reduced job satisfaction, lower morale, a breakdown in trust or public embarrassment, bad press. Nobody really wants to work for the county because they know what's going on there and it sounds like a toxic work environment. And those are more of the intangible things, the whole way up to some of the more tangible things of, legal fees, if these turn into claims and lawsuits as well. So no surprise here either, right? It's not a good situation for the victim, really not a good situation for the organization either. It's kind of a classic lose-lose, but it actually goes beyond this to really a lose-lose-lose. Not a good situation for that source either, the alleged bad actor in this case. More states are finding ways to bypass that at-will employment defense and assign individual liability. So not just going after the employer as an organization, but going after the individual harassers on an individual basis as well. So this is one of those types of situations where you really do not want to be tied up on this on any side. You don't want to be harassed, obviously. You don't want to be at an organization where this stuff's going on. You really don't want to be the harasser either. So it begs the question, why does this stuff happen so much? What mentalities, what kind of dangerous mindsets are out there that lead to these situations? So on this slide, I just want to show a couple of those prevalent mentalities that we've seen in dealing with cases like this that essentially are just playing with fire. Things like, man, everybody needs to lighten up, right? It's all in good fun. You might feel that way and feel like, yeah, I'm just joking around. People take themselves too seriously. I didn't really mean anything by it. But again, intentions are relevant. And if everybody's not on the same page, you can really land yourself in some real hot water, even if you're just trying to have a good time. Another one that's pretty prevalent, that won't happen to us, right? Yeah, I know that people have issues with sexual harassment. You see the big cases coming out of maybe New York or California or something. That won't happen here. We're just a tight-knit family. We like to work hard and play hard. Again, no one's immune to this. This happens really at every level, down to some of our smallest little entities can have issues in this front. how about nobody said anything, so we're all on the same page, right? Like, yeah, we joke around a lot, but hey, nobody's ever complained, so I just assume everybody's good with it. Well, just because nobody said anything doesn't mean they're fine with it, right? These tend to be areas where it can be difficult for people to come forward. It doesn't necessarily mean that they won't snap tomorrow, right? And finally hit that straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. Just because nobody said anything today doesn't mean they can't turn around in a week or a month or a year and say something then, or just up and leave, or file a suit, right? Or, oh, it's always been this way. You know, this is just the environment we have. We work hard. We like to play hard. We haven't had an issue before. Well, attitudes towards what's appropriate are shifting. Just because it's always been this way doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay that way. I'll just explain my side. You know, if something comes of this and we have an issue, you know, I'll just explain that I didn't mean anything by it. And again, this goes back to the fact that, well, it doesn't really matter the way that you meant it towards someone. It matters the way that they took it. So all these things, you know, are I kind of think of them as just being irresponsible, not like overtly malicious, but just kind of playing with fire. But if we're looking at this in a fair and balanced way, it's important to realize, you know, this goes the whole way up to some of the more overtly malicious and can include attitudes like this as well of, hey, I'm entitled to this. And what I mean by that is you will have people who know what they're doing and are trying to see what they can get away with, so to speak. And nobody's ever going to say it in those terms, right? Hey, I'm entitled to this. I can do whatever I want. But that's the attitude that some people have with this. And the best example I can think of is if you can think back to, you know, playing a sport or, you know, pledging in college or, you know, just going to high school in general. Typically, what happens to the freshmen? They get picked on, right? They get hazed when they join their sports teams, and they hate it, right? They're trying to avoid the seniors, like they're running for their lives. They're all scared and they can't stand what's happening. But what happens to those same people by the time they grow up and become seniors? Do they not typically turn around? And I know this is going away a little bit more these days, but I think everybody can at least relate to this. They typically turn around, they start hazing the freshmen again, right? So some people do carry that attitude with them into the workplace as well, thinking, hey, you know, I took a lot when I was coming up through the ranks. This was a big motivator for me to get to the position I'm in. I want to be able to throw my weight around a little bit and exploit my position, so to speak. So that can happen as well. So what can we do if we don't want to be tied up on any side of this? What can we do to prevent harassment? And the good news is it comes down to asking ourselves some common sense questions. Things like, you know, could somebody take this the wrong way? Could this potentially hurt someone? Would I say this in front of a spouse or a parent or a child? Would I mind if my loved ones were treated this way? Would I say it if I was going to be quoted on the front page of the paper? Good one is, hey, do you act the same way towards everyone? You might be tempted to say, oh, you know, that's just my personality. I'm a touchy-feely person. Okay, well, are you? Do you treat everybody the same way, or is that just directed towards one person or a group of people? Ultimately, does it need to be said at all? You know, again, when in doubt, if you're not sure how it's going to land, take that high road. Keep yourself above the fray, so to speak. And as we move towards the end of this class here, I wanted to touch on retaliation as well. This is something that's addressed in your policy, and it's also the most prevalent area that the EEOC gets involved with. The reason being there's a lot of overlap between retaliation and all the individual protected classes. What it is an adverse action that's taken against an employee because they've complained of harassment or discrimination. So it's not necessarily that first offense of picking on somebody. It's, well, they've complained about it, so now we're retaliating against them. And this is all employment decisions, adverse action. This isn't just hiring and firing decisions and say, well, they complained, but I let them keep their job, so now I can treat them however I want. No, this is the whole gamut here. You know, salary reduction, negative performance reviews, you know, taking away the good parking spot, you name it. All of those apply as adverse employment actions. And this applies, and when we say applies, there's protection under federal law from retaliation. And that protection still applies even if the claim is proven to be unfounded. So you might just have a hypersensitive employee who comes to you and says, hey, I think I'm being harassed. I want to file a complaint. You go through your investigation and you actually find differently, right? You find, well, no, it was just, they're kind of making a mountain out of a molehill. It's really all above board. There's no foul play involved. You still can't retaliate against that person. You can't say, man, you gave me all this extra work to do. You're coming in on Saturday and washing all our cars. No, you still can't retaliate against that person because they don't want to discourage people from coming forward with legitimate complaints, right? You might be thinking, man, I think this is happening to me also, but I don't want to come forward because what happens if they disagree, right? So that protection still applies. It's important to realize the term here is unfounded, right? These are still good faith complaints being made where the investigation just finds out differently. This is not referring to just out and out fraudulent claims. That in those cases, of course, adverse action can and should be taken, disciplinary measures at that point. There's also protection for employees who participate in the investigation. As we said before and saw in your policy, the observer is supposed to come forward with what they know as well. They also benefit from this protection from retaliation. You can't retaliate against your coworkers who come forward with what they know. And the rationale is pretty straightforward. You don't want to discourage people from doing that. So right in your policy, of course, we're forbidding retaliation. And again, as we said before, that is only applying to a good faith complaint made. Again, whether or not you agree with it, that protection is still going to apply, but it has to be made in good faith. We're not talking about those fraudulent complaints. And the disciplinary policy part of this piece is the same as what we've seen previously. So whether you're harassing somebody or whether you're retaliating against them for engaging in some sort of protected activity, such as complaining about harassment, that up to and including termination, disciplinary policy still applies. So it's going to be just treated the same way, that first round of harassment would be treated as well. So practical takeaways here as we wrap up: understand your biases and avoid generalizing. The term bias has a pretty negative connotation in our world today. Most of us don't like to admit that we have them, but it is the way that we make sense of the world around us. We don't have the chance to experience everything on a case-by-case basis. So what we're constantly doing is taking in our limited experiences, kind of interpolating them a little bit and projecting them out onto the world around us. That's just how we make sense of stuff. So a great example of this would be, imagine I've never had Italian food before, and I go and I have a really bad meal. It's dry, it's overcooked, whatever it happens to be. I could be tempted to say, oh, Italian food's the worst, and I'm going to generalize here and just say, you never want it, it's all dry, it's all overcooked. And that would be dangerous because that'd be bad news for me. I like Italian food. You can see where I'm going with this. Just because I've had a real negative experience, that's not to take anything away from what's really actually happened to me. But the danger is in making it representative of the whole and saying, well, just because this has happened, now I assume all Italian food's like this. So of course, you know what I'm saying with people as well here. Treat people on a case-by-case basis. Don't generalize. Understand that we're going to have biases based on negative experiences, but we can't make that representative of the whole. Don't assume everybody thinks like you. Be aware of cultural and generational differences. Again, if you're thinking, man, I think this would be really funny or this wouldn't bother me, not everybody feels that way. Be careful with that. And the irony here is I'm going to go ahead and generalize for you, as I just said not to do this, but the cultural and generational differences are pretty real. I can tell you from doing a bunch of these types of trainings, and typically, before all the COVID stuff, these are going to be in person. And as I said, a lot of people don't want to be there, right? They're sitting in the back of the room, rolling their eyes, they're thinking this doesn't apply. And without fail, every time someone comes up to me afterwards and says, hey, thanks for doing this. Like, we actually do have a problem with this or that, or I was hoping we could address this or that. So you do have people that, for as much as you've probably been sitting here thinking, man, I can't wait till he stops talking about this stuff. You've got people that are, this is an important topic for them, and they're thinking that they have issues with it. And as far as the generalization comes in, what I can tell you from my personal experience is this is typically falling on generational lines, where the younger folks coming into the workforce are less willing to tolerate harassment and some of the, kind of borderline behavior that most of us have kind of tolerated in the workforce a little bit more. So what I mean here is attitudes towards what's appropriate are shifting. As we said before, just because it's been this way doesn't mean it's going to be this way. And typically, as a general rule, the younger people coming into the workforce are less tolerant of, we'll say, not the most professional behavior. The things you do today will be judged by tomorrow's standards. So I would imagine that shift that's happening will continue to shift, and we'll get even less tolerant of some of these harassing behaviors. The things you're doing today live forever now, right? Texts that you send, emails that you send are constantly being brought up in as evidence in lawsuits, right? So if you think, man, I don't want this to be on the front page of the paper, I'm just texting my buddy what I think is a funny joke. Be careful with that stuff. That stuff is, you can delete that text off your phone. People still are going to have it, right? Like you're going to be able to find that. You see that constantly with people deleting tweets, and people still find them and post them everywhere, right? So when in doubt, I would say just be more careful than ever with that stuff. It's difficult to come forward. Bystander effect is prevalent, as we said before. Nobody really likes wading into these situations. They typically don't occur in a vacuum. So we want to be more proactive with that. And a lot of times people don't like this bystander effect, and they say, man, if this was a real problem, why didn't somebody say something? Right, wrong, or indifferent, you might agree with it, you might not. What we're finding is this bystander effect does tend to be pretty prevalent. So we need to take a more active role in being proactive to stamp this stuff out. Intentions are relevant. I harped on this quite a bit, so we can leave it at that. But when in doubt, play it safe, right? It's the way that somebody else takes it, and you don't know what their threshold is. So don't push the lines on that. You can land yourself into a lot of hot water just trying to have a good time and joke around. And finally, realize also allegations alone can be really damaging. We really want to conduct ourselves in a very professional way and essentially rise above reproach, because what we've seen from Baycorp's standpoint is sometimes people will lob completely fraudulent claims just to see what sticks. They're not happy with how things are going at work. They want to walk away with something. So hey, sexual harassment, that's on people's minds right now. Let's allege something. So the takeaway here is you don't even want to be thrown into an allegation of harassment. So you got to keep yourself as squeaky clean as ever before. So be really careful. As we said before, when in doubt, play it safe there. The whole point of all this is just to have a more professional workplace. Nobody really wants to dread coming to work in the morning and think, man, I'm going to have to hide in a broom closet if so-and-so is walking down the hall. We want to have positive relationships. Treat people with consideration and respect. Typically, the more you give it, the more you're getting that back. Cultivate these positive relationships at all levels, right? We talked about the fact that harassment isn't just from the supervisor down to a subordinate. This comes from outside vendors, peers, coworkers. So cultivate those relationships, treat people well. You typically will get that back in return. And finally, as we close, communication is really the key here. Be careful not to offend people with what you're saying, but it's beyond that, right? It's not just verbal, it's the nonverbal stuff, it's gestures, it's mannerisms, it's things we're displaying, it's our physical conduct as well. So be careful with that stuff. Take the high road when in doubt. On the flip side, if you are somebody who's been offended, right, we talked about the fact that you do have some power in that situation. You can speak up if you're offended. If you're a bystander, you can come forward. You can tell the source, hey, you probably want to cool it, right? This isn't really landing well. And ultimately, communicate those issues through the appropriate channels. We looked at your policy. You know that you can talk to your supervisor. You can talk to your department head. You can also go to HR. So make sure you're using the policy and reporting things up the chain of command. Because at the end of the day, as we said before, everybody wants to be treated with consideration and respect. Nobody wants to be just absolutely dreading coming to work. So that's the whole point, is just to cultivate a professional, healthy work environment. So I appreciate you tuning in. I hope that this was helpful for you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.